Hi, Father.
Hi.
Thank you very much for sitting down with me and answering some questions about the Latin Mass that other people might be curious about.
Okay.
A lot of people aren't familiar with the Latin Mass, and they may wonder why it's said in Latin, and they may feel a little disconnected from it because they don't know Latin. And so maybe you can answer the question as to why the Mass is in Latin, and I think people feel that it might inhibit them from participating in the Mass.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because we look at language as a vehicle of information. So when we want to express our thought to someone else, we're going to speak to them in a language that they will understand so that we can get our point across to them. And that's the common understanding of someone when they go to Mass. They're going to want to be able to understand the Mass and also express their feelings to God in a language that they understand. And that's the common opinion of people, especially when I meet someone on the street and they will say to me, well, they'll be surprised that the Mass is in Latin, because they say, well, who understands Latin anyway, and why do we have that? However, at the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, we're talking about offering a sacrifice to God. And the vehicle that we use to offer that sacrifice is a ritual based on language. So instead of actions like you would do in the Old Testament, take the animal, sacrifice him, sprinkle the blood, we have actions in the Mass, but it's also embellished with many prayers offered to God. And in that aspect, we're no longer talking about a language for the use of education. We're not talking about a language for the use of communication. We're talking about using language to offer a sacrifice to God. And since He is a supreme being, it falls to logic that we're going to want to use a mode of language that has not been corrupted by common use. That's why you pull apart a language that is no longer used, that is a real language that was used at one time. However, it's been sanctified now and it's been used exclusively for the glory of God, so it cannot be corrupted by the common use. That being said, the average person can assist at Mass by uniting themselves to these prayers that are being offered to God in this holy language by using a missal. And I've got a missal here. And you open up the missal, and on the one side it will have the Latin, on the other side it will have English. So you can follow along the prayers that the priest is saying, offering this sacrifice to God in the language that you will understand, and you will be able to unite your heart to the sacrifice going on. So it is possible to assist at Mass, whether it be in your language or not in your language, because you're assisting at Mass by reading and following along the prayers that the priest is saying, while those prayers are being offered in your part by the priest who does know Latin and who does know how to communicate with God in a language that he understands, because he does understand Latin.
So is it necessary to actually follow along with every single prayer that's in the Missal? Is that the highest participation that we can have during the Mass, or can you do pray a rosary during Mass?
Well, it's certainly a form of participation, and it's a very good form to follow along prayer by prayer, but it's not essential that the person in the pew say every single word or repeat every single word that the priest is already praying for them. They're required to be at Mass, not necessarily required to say the Mass. So by being there, they can unite their hearts to these prayers being said, and no, it's not necessary to follow along word for word what the priest is saying. They could be uniting themselves to Our Lady at the foot of the cross by praying a rosary, or they could be meditating on what the priest is doing, very much like the monks in the desert would do, uniting their hearts and souls to the Mass by a more elevated form of prayer, which is meditation. So it's not required that they follow word for word what's going on. They certainly are going to want to not be distracted. So if that's the easiest and best way for them to assist at Mass and to avoid distractions, that's the way to do it. But otherwise, if it's inhibiting them from praying in a more serious way, then they should go ahead and pray in a more devout way, however they can.
Okay. And so when you say assist at Mass, I think a lot of people think that means they have to be an altar server or something like that. So when we say participation, the most common way for someone to participate is to actually pray during the Mass or unite the prayers with the Mass, correct?
That's correct. This goes back to Old Testament times when The priest would be offering sacrifice in the Holy of Holies, whereas people would be in the men's court or in the women's court or in the Levites' court. They would be in another part of the church, another part of the temple. And they would know that the sacrifice is going on simply because of the time of day. They would know at the 9th hour there's a sacrifice going on, at the 11th hour there's a sacrifice going on, and they would offer up their own prayers to God while uniting themselves to this sacrifice that they didn't even see, that was in another part of the temple. The same thing goes at Mass. We're required to be at Mass to show our unity with the mystical body of Christ at Mass while Christ offers himself to the Father in the sacrifice, which is the representation of the sacrifice of Calvary. However, by uniting the prayers that you're saying to the Mass, that is how you're participating. The best form of participation is actually from the heart, that you are offering up your sacrifice together with the sacrifice of Christ.
Okay, and that will kind of lead us up to the next question, which is the priest. Now many people say they feel uncomfortable because the priest has their back to them, and we know that almost all the ancient liturgies that that are celebrated today in the Catholic Church, including all of the Eastern liturgies, that the priest has their back faced away or faced towards the congregation, their back, so that the people may feel alienated that the priest has their back to them. So why is that? Why is that the way that the Latin Mass is celebrated?
Well, you'll notice for several times during the Mass, the priest will actually turn around to the people and he will address them. So he'll say Dominus vobiscum to them, Lord be with you. He'll ask them to pray for the sacrifice, that it be acceptable. When he turns around and says Orate Fratres, he'll turn around to give them a blessing. He'll turn towards them when he preaches a sermon. But for the rest of the time, he's not talking to the people. He's talking to God. And it's a directional prayer. We're praying to God. We're not praying about God, or we're not praying for God. We're praying to God. Being a directional prayer, it's like everything else directional, like the father driving the car on the way home. He's not going to be facing the family, even if he is talking to the family, because they're going somewhere, and if he's not keeping his eye on the road, they're going to have an accident. Also an army. The general in the army is not going to be facing the soldiers in the army while he's at war, because he is leading them in battle. He is going to be the first to face the enemy, and they are going to be facing the enemy with him. With Mass, it's the same thing. What we have done is we are facing God. That's why all the pews are facing the same direction. But from among us, we have a mediator between God and man, which is the priest, and he is in the forefront. We have, as it were, pushed him forward, and he is interceding to God for us behind him. We're all facing the same direction, and he is our leader, leading us in this prayer going towards God. So it's not a question of who the priest has his back to, it's a question of who we're all praying to and directing that prayer to God.